number is 700,000 slaves in the United States. This is when the cotton gin is invented in 1793. This is about a generation, like right after the Constitution is ratified. Less than a generation, actually. It's within 5 years of the Constitution being ratified, right? It's during Washington's presidency, the first president. So this is the early stage of America as a nation. In the first census, there were roughly 700,000 slaves, and that was in 1790. And then about 20 years later, in 1808, this is when the slave trade, which was allowed to exist under the Constitution. So the slave trade is abolished in 1808. The Constitution allows for, if you look at the Constitution, and this is still in the Constitution, it allows for the slave trade. It does not call it the slave trade, right? It's the importation of such persons, like the bringing in such certain people, slaves, and it's allowed to exist for 20 years from the time of ratification. And when the Constitution is ratified, it's 1788. So 20 years after that is 1808. That's when the international slave trade is abolished. So that the population in 1808 is 1.2 million. There are 1.2 million slaves in the U.S. So in 18 years, it's almost doubled, right? It's almost doubled. It's called a peculiar institution. Before the Revolution, you have indentured servants, you have slaves, right? You have all these different people whose status is free or unfree. You have Indian nations. And so there's all these different people, white and non-white, who are like in sort of a situation where they're free, they're semi-free, right? There's all these levels. It's a more stratified society. And slavery slowly becomes abolished in the North after the Revolution, right? People are given their freedom for fighting in the Revolution. And then after the Revolution, the northern states begin the process of emancipating their slaves, either gradually or more suddenly. So slavery is now is not just an accepted thing in the entire country, right? Indentured servants aren't around anymore. So, and also you're this country now that's basically stated we're a country based on equality and protection before the law, and we're all equal, right? And this idea of universal rights. Basically a situation where the southern slave states in this country become more and more isolated. But ideologically, as far as relying on slave labor, and how and the sort of mindset that creates that situation, and also geographically, they're isolated. Mexico is going to abolish slavery in 1829, and then a few years later, beginning in the 1830s, basically England, starting in 1833, the British have ended slavery, right? Abolished it. So you have northern states that don't have slavery. You have the slave trade is abolished. You have Mexico. When England abolishes slavery, Canada is still a colonial territory of England. So Canada is abolishes slavery in the 1830s. French and Dutch colonial territory and slavery in the Western Hemisphere. So there's very few places left where slavery is legal. There's Cuba, Brazil. So basically you have a situation where there are 15 states. There are 15 states in the United States, all in the southern part of the United States, where slavery is legal. And it is becoming, it's a peculiar institution because when the country's founded, there are hundreds of thousands of slaves. But then you have this situation where these southern states are now one of the few places left where this is legal, and the slave population is growing. By the time that Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860, there are 4 million slaves. By 1860, there are more slaves in 1860 than there ever were at any time in America. There are more states where slavery is legal, and there are about 500,000 folks who are called free black Americans. Mostly people who were freed because they fought in the Revolution. They were given their freedom, and then the descendants of those folks, right, living in northern cities and some in the South. And the population of the South is only it's about 8 million white Southerners, and they're only owned. The thing is, in 15 states where it's legal, and they represent 1/3 of the population.
Zach can't come to the phone right now. He's on his way to pick up his season tickets to detention. If you'd like to leave a message, please wait for the beep.
Southern population of white Southern families that own 20 or more slaves. That's usually considered the mark for becoming what's called the planter class. So social status based on ownership of slaves and owning large amounts of land, a lot of land and a lot of slaves. There's more wealth in the ownership of slaves they're going to represent a larger asset. By 1860, there are 4 million slaves. They're worth, in 1860, $3 billion. It's the largest concentration of wealth, right? If you took all the railroads and all the factories in the north and all the buildings and everything, it would not have, this was the largest concentration of wealth in the country, right? And that's just in the slaves. The people who own the slaves also own a lot of land, a lot of the best land, right? They're called the planter class, or they're called the sometimes they'll be referred to as the slave power, slavocracy. An aristocracy based on slave ownership. So 3% of the population own 20 or more slaves. There are about 23% of people, right, who own at least, maybe 3 slaves, maybe 10, somewhere below 20, but they own at least 1, right? And then 74%, 3/4 of the population of white Southerners don't own any slaves. I mean, think about that. There's going to be a war that's fought in the 1860s entirely revolving around this issue, which you'll hear a lot of sort of representation of history where people say it wasn't. This is the primary issue of the Civil War. And there are going to be 300, 400,000 Southerners who are going to die as soldiers in this war, 300,000. There are going to be 100,000 Southerners who are going to starve to death. Every single major Southern, a lot of the Southern cities, like Richmond and Charleston and all these places, are going to be bombarded and leveled. They're going to face severe damage, right? And basically it's all because of an institution of forced labor, which really you have about 3% of the population that is really controls and is really powerful over. Basically, even though there's only 3% of the population that owns slaves, they're very powerful. They're very wealthy, right? They control a lot of the political structure, but also this other 75% or this other 75% that own no slaves. They own no slaves, right? And that's usually cited as a reason that slavery wasn't that big of a deal in the South, like it wasn't the reason for the Civil War, and that's wrong. Right, it was the primary reason. That 75% who own no slaves, they're hired as overseers, right? There's other work that people get that tie them into this slave institution. Plus, even if you own no slaves, if this system exists because it's basically justified by saying that black people, that these who are slaves, all slaves are black, right? At this, in this America, right? That they're inferior, that they're savages, that this is the best way, this is the only way that they can even live like a decent life is to basically enslave it. All of that really racist white supremacist stuff, right? If everyone in the South has been told that, if you're a white Southerner who owns no land, what happens when they get their freedom? And then they can buy land, and they have land, and you don't have land, right? Aren't you supposed to be better than them? They're supposed to be savage, right? You know what I'm saying? What happens when they start wanting to get married, and they there's a massive fear, and it's a propaganda tool. It was used back in the 1860s that if you freed slaves, then there would be an issue of violence, particularly sexual violence, committed by black men, former slaves, against white women. But in fact, the reality is the opposite, right? You had a situation where these slave owners, you think about 4 million people, right? 4 million slaves. That's roughly 2 million female slaves. And there is literally no legal framework to prevent any sort of, in fact, the laws encourage sexual assault, right? Not just in our own time, we have issues where people feel maybe the police or the district attorney or whoever wasn't aggressive enough in believing their accusation and prosecuting somebody, right? Women have that sort of feel a certain way about that. But this is a situation where the law is actually designed to encourage the sexual assault of slave owners, right? Remember that 1662 law in Virginia, right? It encourages it. And it happened, so you imagine there's 2 million women in the South who are slaves who very likely have firsthand knowledge or know somebody who's had to deal with this issue. And there's no, it's not just something that happens once or a random incident, right? It's the person you're someone's legal property. Legal property. And you can imagine, think about how the trauma, the level of trauma, right? You have a slave who's sexually assaulted by her owner. If she's married to another slave, that marriage is not legally recognized, right? the person who's her husband and wife, right? They're the legal property of another. So it's not as if if a husband tries to intercede or protect his wife, he's completely has no legal framework to do that, right? Because he's not a husband who's protecting his wife. He's someone's property. She's someone's property, right? And the property owner, that's the property owner who wants to, the law is structured in a way to protect that, right? So you can imagine like if a female slave gets sexually assaulted by her slave owner, and then her husband, this other slave, who has no real power over protecting her, but is so frustrated that ends and needs to take out is angry, but he can't hit his owner, so he takes it out on his wife who's a slave who just got raped. Like you can imagine how if you take that generation after generation, that sort of life is a very stressful, volatile environment, right? There's a lot of violence used to enforce it. There's a lot of psychological stuff used to enforce it, right? And so when it comes to organizing militias and slave patrols and being armed, the population in the South being armed, all of these things are being put in place to ensure that the system continues and is also protected against any sort of uprisings or something, or rebellion. And they're able to do that. One of the reasons is because there are more white people. There's six or seven white people in the South for every 3 or 4 slaves, right? There's twice as many. And other places like Haiti in Haiti, where there's a slave revolution in Haiti, they're literally 90%. Slaves are 90% of the population. 4 million slaves, and slavery is expanding beyond the borders of the states where it exists in 1860, right? There's all this new territory acquired from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. So, as far as the actual life for these folks, you have constant sale, right? Family members who are sold. You have women who are slaves who are sexually assaulted by their owner, who get pregnant, who have a child who's the biological father is their slave owner. They're theoretically 50% white. They're slaves in law. They're slaves. And then down the road, that slave owner, who is this person's biological father, could sell this slave, the child, right? They could sell him away. They never see him again, right? There's no control over that. It happened in Jefferson's plantation. When Jefferson died, he was in debt. So even though he gave his slaves their freedom in his will, he could have freed them when he was still alive, but he freed him in his will. When he died, he had debt, so the people who handled his trust, his estate, had to basically pay off his debt. So they had to sell off a lot of his slaves. Right, and sometimes you're not selling. It's like people don't want all 4 or 5 slaves that are a part of this slave family. You sell the kids.
Zach can't come to the phone right now. He's on his way to pick up his season tickets to detention. If you'd like to leave a message, please wait for the beep.
So, but how does the North fit into this issue of slavery? Are they dependent on it? And are they dependent? Think about are they dependent on slave labor being used in the South? But slave labor is producing the stuff that they're using, right? Cotton. Think about cotton and how it's used in the early factories in this country are textile factories. They make cloth, like fabric, clothing, and that requires cotton, right? So even though they don't have a system where slavery is legal in their state, and they might not even like slavery, they're still complicit. They're doing business with people who own slaves and who are having slaves, produce the cotton that they're using. The Underground Railroad is one of many forms of ways in which slaves would escape, slaves would resist, right? There are all sorts of slave uprisings and forms of resistance. Armed rebellions, right? The most notable being the Nat Turner Rebellion or the Southampton Uprising, 1831 in Virginia, 1831. And none of them are ever successful enough to abolish slavery or something, even in one state, but that's because their population is significantly smaller, right? And it's illegal for them to own guns. It's illegal in most places for slaves to know how to read, to know how to own guns. There are laws in these southern states dealing with how many slaves can meet, how they can meet together, when they can meet together. Assembly, public assembly, right? We have freedom of assembly theoretically under the Constitution, right? Slaves couldn't do that. They couldn't establish their own churches. They couldn't pray together. They couldn't, if there's too many of them in public together, they would, there are rules. Because what are they doing over there? Are they plotting against it? Probably. Because they, basically all these laws to restrict the life of slaves, basically. So the Underground Railroad is one way which slaves could escape. It's not all there's not going to be open resistance. I mean, there are about 1,000 every year. It's estimated that 1,000 slaves ran away, but about 1,000 slaves who escape each year. right? And during the Civil War, that number is it's gonna explode. Once they're aware that there's the Union Army's there, and there's a government in the United States that actually is fighting a war basically over slavery, and there's the chance that they could get their freedom, and there's somebody that's going to some place where they can go, right? Because if you're in a southern state, if you're in the deep south, and you have to, there's no interstate highway, and you can't just get on a train. You have to basically go on foot through several states, right? Like without any roads or any, what we would think of as roads. It's very, and then what are you going to do? What are you going to do for work? When you get somewhere, like how are you going to? And what happens if you have kids or family members? You can't just leave them necessarily, even though this you can't bring them with you. You can't bring like a toddler with you crossing rivers and doing all this and having people hunting slave patrols. It's very dangerous, right? So a lot of the time there was the forms of resistance that you would see most commonly was just what's called day-to-day resistance or silent sabotage, theft. Like people who would break tools, right? You're working 14-hour days. If you're a plantation slave, you're working in a field. You're working 12, 14-hour days, maybe longer, for nothing, for literally nothing. Like that's just how everything. And that's how this is from the time you're old enough to go out into a field and start picking cotton. That's what you do for 6 days a week or 7 days a week, right? And so people would run. A lot of times, people would run away. Slaves would run away, and they would not attempt to go to a northern state or like Canada. But they would just, if there was a wooded area nearby, they would just go into hide out for a couple days because it's like you can imagine how, if there's a full moon, they have to keep working when the sun goes down. If it's bright enough, if there's enough natural light. Yeah, so most slaves who did successfully run away, actually, Frederick Douglass and I believe Harriet Tubman, both of them are from Maryland. The upper South, you have the states that because Virginia and Maryland, but the upper South. So Virginia is basically a place where slavery is legal, and then Pennsylvania right there is not. So all you got to do is it could be several hundred miles, but you're crossing from the part of one state across the border into another, which is more probable, right? There's a greater chance of that actually you being able to do that. Whereas if you're in Alabama or you're in Louisiana, you got to go through like 3 or 4 different states, on foot. That's just. And even then, when people would get to the north, there were bounty hunters. Even in places like Montreal in Canada, there were bounty hunters. Solomon Northrop, who wasn't even a slave, he was a free black person, but he's kidnapped basically. That could happen, and that could happen too, right? Especially if you're a black person in like New York City and someone clubs you over the head, and next thing you know, you wake up and you're in South Carolina, you were kidnapped. What are you going to do? You can't call the cops. You're in South Carolina, right, where black people are pretty much slaves and they have no real rights, so you can't just go to court. Harriet Tubman, a lot of people, you'll see a lot of stuff on the web where she was an agent in the Underground Railroad, right? It's basically a collection of people and a collection of routes and stations where people, abolitionists, white abolitionists, and former slaves, would go and into the South and basically, help people, assist people in escaping. Or if people escaped on their own, they would find people associated with the Underground Railroad and they would get them, shelter, which is illegal. And the laws, they're breaking the law, right? Is anyone familiar with the people who put water and food at certain stations along the border where the United States shares with Mexico? Did you know that? There was a guy who actually there was a certain spot where he would leave food and water for any undocumented people coming through the desert who needed it, and he was arrested actually and put on trial for that. Really not really dangerous stuff. Just leaving him a bottle of water, like he was. So that's imagine that's what they were doing basically, right? Giving someone a place to stay, figuring out where they were going to go. And Harriet Tubman, on the web you'll see a lot of a lot of sites that say she helped 300 people escape. It's a very inflated number. It's not. It was maybe like 100 or 70, somewhere in there. Not that it matters. It doesn't make her like less relevant. It's just accuracy. So, and she's also a spy. She's also a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War. A lot of these slaves because this is a person who ran. Harriet Tubman's is a really compelling story, and she's a really interesting person because she ran away. She was a slave. She escaped, and then she kept going back to the place where she could easily be enslaved again or killed, right? And they just execute her. They put her on trial and kill her, right? Because she's helping other people escape, right? she's basically stealing. I mean, in the eyes of Southerners, she's doing this. It's like terrorism and theft. Obviously, they're stealing also because they're not paying people and they're getting lots of work out of them and building lots of wealth from it, and they're terrorizing them with violence and stuff. So, but yeah. So that's why it's a compelling thing, because Frederick Douglass escapes once, right? And he's in the North, and he's an educated person. He's an abolitionist. He writes. He gives speeches. But he doesn't just go back to the South and start giving speeches there. Like, he stays in the North around where he's free. He doesn't put himself in a situation where he could be re-enslaved again necessarily. Harriet Tubman does it several times.